Nobody ever expects evil to live inside their own home, not behind familiar walls, not among ordinary boxers, not in a place you walk past every single day without thinking twice. Yet some of the darkest stories in human history begin exactly there, not with screams, not with violence in the open, but with silence, with routine, with people choosing not to ask questions because the answers might destroy everything they believe. This story begins with a man who thought he was starting over. After years behind bars, he returned home with one simple goal: rebuild his life, reconnect with his family, clean out the clutter left behind by time and absence. But what he found inside his garage was not clutter. It was not trash. It was not something that could be explained away. It was wrapped carefully, hidden deliberately, and sealed with intention. In that moment, his entire understanding of his marriage, his home, and his past collapsed. Because some discoveries do not just shock you, they rewire the way you see the world forever. Stay with me until the end of this story, not because it is sensational, but because it reveals how horror can hide in plain sight for years, while life goes on above it, as if nothing is wrong. This is not just a true crime story. This is a psychological descent into denial, addiction, fear, and the devastating cost of silence. When police arrived, they were met by a man who looked broken in ways words could not describe. His hand shook, his voice cracked. His eyes carried the weight of something he did not yet fully understand. He kept repeating the same sentence. "I do not know what this is. I do not know how this got here." The garage itself looked unremarkable. Boxers stacked high, old belongings covered in dust. The kind of place people avoid cleaning for years because it holds too many memories. But as officers began opening box after box, the air changed. There was a smell, not immediately overpowering, but wrong. Something that told experienced investigators that this was not a simple misunderstanding. And then they opened the first one. What they saw inside forced them to step back. Not because they were unfamiliar with death, but because this death did not belong here. It was not a crime scene left in the open. It was something someone had tried desperately to erase. As the investigation unfolded, one question rose above all others. How does something like this happen without anyone noticing? Neighbors lived next door. Family members visited. Children played nearby. Life continued. And yet, hidden just a few feet away, the truth sat untouched for years. If you have ever trusted someone completely, if you have ever believed that the people closest to you could never commit something unspeakable, this story will challenge that belief, because sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves: that everything is normal, that nothing is wrong, that some questions are better left unasked. But the garage told a different story, and once the first box was opened, there was no turning back. While officers secured the garage, detectives turned their attention to the one person who could explain the impossible. The woman who lived there. The woman who had walked past those boxers for years. The woman who knew exactly what was hidden inside. When she came in for questioning, she didn't seem like a monster. She just looked worn out and frail, worn down by years of poor decisions and chemical dependency. And that was the first mistake many people made, because evil rarely announces itself with horns and rage. More often, it arrives quietly, wrapped in excuses and fear. The detectives started gently, not with accusations, not with anger, but with questions designed to give her room to tell the truth. What happened? When did this begin? Why was help never called? Her answers came out slowly, messy, and full of contradictions. She talked about stress and drugs, about being alone. She described giving birth in silence, without medical care, without witnesses. She claimed the baby did not cry, that it never breathed, that it was already gone. And for a moment, the room was quiet, because stillbirths do happen. Fear can really freeze people in their tracks. Shock can lead to some awful choices. But something about her story just felt off. She spoke too casually about concealment, too comfortably about hiding evidence. She moved on to Isley, like nothing had happened. The detective listened closely, not to her words, but to what she avoided. As the questioning continued, new information arrived from the scene. Another box opened. Then another, each one sealed and hidden away. Each one holding the same unspeakable truth. When detectives informed her that more remains had been found, her body language changed. Her shoulders slumped. Her breathing became shallow. Her eyes stopped meeting theirs. That was the moment denial collapsed. She no longer tried to explain. She began to confess. Bataventen, the truth, came in fragments. She admitted there were more. She could not remember how many. She blamed the drugs. She blamed fear. She blamed everything except herself. The detective pressed gently but firmly. How many, where, over how long? Years. Multiple pregnancies. Repeated concealment. Not one mistake. Not one moment of panic. Apata. Investigators now realized they weren't just facing a tragic event. They were uncovering a troubling pattern of behavior, a cycle of secrecy, addiction, and deliberate choices. And then came the question that changed everything. Were any of the babies alive when they were born? There was a long pause, a silence heavier than words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. She said some of them were alive. That admission shifted the entire case. This was no longer just a disposal issue. This was murder. The detective kept his voice calm. He did not show anger. He simply asked her to explain, and as she spoke, the room filled with a heaviness that words cannot capture. She described fear overwhelming her. She described panic. She described moments she could never undo. She admitted that instead of calling for help, she chose silence, because staying quiet felt easier than facing the fallout. Meanwhile, officers kept digging through box after box, corner after corner. Each discovery deepened the horror. What shocked them most was not just the number. It was the intent. These were not careless acts. They were deliberate, repeated, hidden with precision. Every single day, she lived with this secret, cooking meals, raising kids, and going to bed at night, with the truth sitting just feet away. And no one knew. If this story is affecting you, stay with it. Not because it is easy to hear, but because understanding how this happened is the only way to prevent it from happening again. Because the most dangerous monsters are not strangers. They are people who learn to live with secrets. By the time the interrogation reached its next phase, the room no longer felt like a place for answers. It felt like reality was crumbling. The detective faced her, asking questions not out of curiosity, but because he had to. Because now every word mattered. Lives had been taken. Time had passed, and the truth could no longer be avoided. He returned to the moment she kept describing. Te, bathroom, the silence, the fear. He asked her to explain again, slowly, exactly what happened after the babies were born. Not what she felt, not what she believed, but what she did. Her hands trembled. Her eyes filled, not with tears, but with a deep dread. She spoke in shaky fragments, as if the full truth might crush her. She admitted that at least some of the babies were alive, that she could see movement, that she noticed signs of life. And when asked what she did next, her voice broke. She said she panicked. She said she did not know what to do. She said she was afraid. But fear does not explain everything. Fear does not repeat itself again and again over years. Fear does not create systems. The detective leaned in, ready to ask the question that had been hanging in the air all along. Did you cause their deaths? The room fell silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. And then she nodded. Barely. But enough. She admitted that she had ended their lives. Not all at once. Not in one moment of madness. Over time, one by one. That confession marked the point of no return. There was no misunderstanding. No tragic accident. This was intentional harm. The detective closed his eyes for a moment. Not because he was overwhelmed, but he had to hold on to his humanity in a place that felt so inhuman. As she confessed, more details spilled out. She talked about wrapping the bodies and sealing them away, hiding them where no one would look. She confessed she moved them when necessary, rearranged things around them, and cleaned the garage every year, and no one ever noticed. The detective asked her why she never sought help, why she never told anyone, why she never stopped. Her answer was simple. She was afraid of being judged, afraid of losing her children, afraid of prison, afraid of the truth. So she chose secrecy. Secrecy turned into her prison. Meanwhile, back at the house, investigators kept searching and found even more remains, draining the room of all color. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Officers who had worked decades in law enforcement stood frozen. Nothing could really prepare them for this. The heaviness settled in their chests not just from the loss of life, but from all those years of silence. When the detective returned to the interrogation room, he was no longer seeking information. He was seeking understanding. He asked if anyone else knew. She said no. He asked if her husband ever suspected anything. She shook her head. When he asked how she lived normally, she just said she tried not to think about it. That was the moment everyone realized the truth. This was not just a crime. This was compartmentalization taken to its extreme. A person dividing reality into pieces small enough to survive, until the walls finally collapsed. If you are still listening, this is where the story changes. Because what comes next is not about her. It's about the ripple effects. The people who had no clue, the man who opened that garage, the kids who grew up in that house, and the justice system now faced with something beyond comprehension. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing. Not for the story, but to understand how silence becomes dangerous, because awareness is the first step toward prevention. While the investigation continued to unravel one of the most disturbing cases the department had ever seen, another story was quietly unfolding in parallel. The story of a man who had walked into his own garage and unknowingly stepped into a nightmare. Darren was brought in for questioning, not as a suspect at first, but as someone standing at the center of an unimaginable reality. He looked exhausted, not just tired, drained. The kind of exhaustion that hits when everything you thought you knew about your life crumbles in a single day. The detectives laid it all out for him. One baby, then another, then another. The number kept rising. Darren listened, frozen. He figured it had to be a mix-up, right? Just a misunderstanding that would clear up soon. But it did not. Each new detail pulled him further away from the life he thought he knew. They asked him about the pregnancies, how many he knew about, how many he suspected. He shared what he knew. He was aware of his daughters and recalled one miscarriage. Nothing else. The detectives struggled with this. How could someone live with a partner for years and not notice all those pregnancies? But as they kept questioning him, one thing was clear. There was no evidence linking him to the crimes. No fingerprints, no involvement. No signs of awareness, just confusion and devastation. Darren broke down. Not quietly, not subtly. He buried his face in his hands and sobbed, not because he was being accused, but he was realizing something even more painful. The woman he loved had been living a double life, one where he was present and one where he was completely absent. The detective asked him a simple question. What would you have done if you had known? I would have helped. That was not said to save himself. It was said from a place of disbelief. The thought that all of this happened without his knowledge was tearing him apart. Meanwhile, forensic teams were on it, working tirelessly. Every box, every layer of tape, every bag, everything was documented, tested, catalogued. The results were undeniable. Every fingerprint belonged to her. Not a single trace of Darren was found on anything used to hide the remains. DNA tests confirmed what everyone dreaded. He was the biological father of all of them. And yet, he never knew they existed. The children who lived in the home were interviewed by specialists, carefully, gently. They had noticed strange smells at times, but they were told it was animals, or garbage, or nothing important. They had trusted the adults around them, and now they would have to grow up carrying a truth that should never belong to a child. As the evidence mounted, the case became airtight. There were no more unanswered questions, only consequences. The confession, the forensic proof, the timeline, everything aligned. And now, the justice system had to respond. If you are still listening, this is where the story reaches a critical point, because justice does not undo harm. It does not restore lives. But it does acknowledge truth, and sometimes that is all that remains. If this story has affected you, subscribe, not because this content is easy to hear, but because these stories matter, because silence allows darkness to grow. The courtroom was silent, not the kind of silence that feels calm, but the kind that presses against your chest, the kind that carries the weight of things that can never be undone. Mega Huntsman stood before the judge. No longer a mystery, no longer a mystery. Just the person behind one of the state's most shocking cases. She pleaded guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder. 1 count acknowledged as stillborn. The court accepted the plea. And then came the sentence. 6 terms, 5 years to life, served consecutively. A sentence designed to ensure one thing: she would never walk free again. Not in this lifetime. As the judge read the sentence, the room was eerily quiet. No screams, no dramatic falls, just a quiet stillness, as if the gravity of what had happened had finally settled. But for those sitting in that room, the sentence did not bring relief. Only finality. Darren was there, sitting quietly, listening, struggling to wrap his head around a truth that would haunt him forever. 7 children, 7 lives he never knew were there. 7 chances that were lost before they even began. He did not speak. He did not look up, because there are moments where words simply do not exist. Outside the courtroom, people ask the same questions. How could this happen for so long? How did no one know? How did drugs erase every instinct? How did fear overpower compassion? But the truth is, not every horror has a clean answer. Sometimes the explanation is not a single cause, but a chain. Addiction, isolation, fear, shame, silence, each one feeding the next. Until the unthinkable becomes possible. The house was emptied, the garage cleared, the boxers removed. But the memory remained. Neighbors would later say they could never look at the house the same way again, because once you know what happened somewhere, that place is changed forever. The children who survived would grow up carrying a story they never asked for, one that would follow them quietly. In conversations, in headlines, in whispers. They would need years of healing, support, and understanding. Because they were victims, too. The detectives involved in the case later admitted something rare. This case stayed with them. Not because of the evidence, not because of the procedure, but because of the human cost. One detective said he had to step away during the interrogation, because hearing a mother describe such acts without emotion broke something inside him. Another said it reminded him why some cases are never forgotten. And that brings us to the hardest part. The question that lingers long after the story ends. How many stories like this never get discovered? How many remain hidden behind closed doors? How many signs go unnoticed because people assume someone else will act, or because fear convinces people to stay silent? This story is not just about a crime. It is about what happens when isolation replaces connection. When addiction replaces clarity, when silence replaces intervention, and when fear replaces responsibility. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you uncomfortable, subscribe. Not because this content is easy, but because these stories matter. They remind us to pay attention, to ask questions, to notice when something feels wrong, and to never underestimate the cost of silence. Some stories end with justice, others end with healing. This one ends with a warning, because the most terrifying monsters are not always strangers. Sometimes they live quietly, hidden, in plain sight, and the only thing that allows them to exist is not being seen.